Great. It's just gone past midday, so let's make a start. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Swinney, and I am Director of Policy and Research here at Centre for Cities. What I'm going to do for the next half an hour is to run through the main findings from our flagship publication, Cities Outlook 2025, which came out a couple of weeks ago, with a particular focus on Scotland's four biggest cities, so Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and Dundee. Now, the main focus each year of Cities Outlook changes. This year, the focus is on how wages differ across the country and what that means for the government's industrial strategy, but also local plans that are being put together currently. But those of you who know Outlook will know that in its 18th year, the thing that has been consistent throughout all those 18 years is a table, top 10, bottom 10, of a range of different indicators as well to do with the economy. So what I'll do is I'll run through the main focus of the report this year in the presentation, then talk you a little bit about the data monitor of Outlook and the data tool that we have that you can play with, and then we'll open out to questions for the last 9 minutes or so. So without any further ado, let me share my screen and I can run you through the main presentation. There's a Q&A function in Zoom. We will get to them. So if you have any questions that occur to you while I'm doing the presentation, please do stick them in there and I'll get through as many of those as I possibly can in the section at the end. Right. So what does the main focus of Cities Outlook say about Scotland's cities? So the first thing to say is that Outlook looks at the differentiation in wages that we see across the country. And it says, the government wants to put more money in people's pockets in all parts of the UK. What's the scale of the challenge currently and what's the variation that exists? So this chart tells us three things. The first one is that there is variation. I don't think that's probably going to be a surprise to anybody on this call, but it's probably more the scale of the variation that is probably more surprising. I think the good thing for Scotland is that actually it's one of the better off regions in terms of workplace wages. It comes out second there in the list of all the regions on this chart, with Great South East being at the top and then the North East being at the bottom. The second thing this chart says is that it splits each region into two. Light green being urban, so the four cities in Scotland I talked about in Scotland's instance, and the dark green being non-urban, so basically the rest of the region or the country. And what we can see here is that the light green bars are higher in every region or country of the UK than the dark green bars. This is very much telling us that cities lead the way in their regions. Even if that region or nation underperforms, the cities are still the ones where the wages are the highest, leading their regional economy, even if the regional economy is not doing very well. The third point to note is that the big difference between nations and regions is not between non-urban areas, but between urban areas. So if we look at the dark green bars there, you can see there's a bit of variation between them as you look across the different parts of the UK, but actually that variation is relatively small. Scotland non-urban wages about £636. Looking across, that sort of puts it middle of a quietly tight pack. So there's not a great deal of variation there. What this is telling us is that the variation that we see across the country is not driven by the underperformance or the variance in performance of non-urban areas. Actually, the variation we see across the country is driven by the variation between the cities, where you can see that there's a much greater difference in absolute terms between those light green bars. Now, in Scotland's instance, it is only one of two parts of the UK where urban wages actually are above the national average. And that's part of the reason why Scottish wages are as high as what they are. Certainly not as high as urban wages in the Greater South East. I think there's probably still potentially a bit of work done there to work for policy to try and close that gap somewhat. But at the very least, performing much better than the rest of the country. The question then is, well, why is that? What is going on in terms of this wage performance? And that's what this chart tries to do. So there's a number of things going on here. Let me explain what the chart's showing, and then we can unpack what the implications are. So we split the economy into two groups. We've got local services and exporting activities. Local services are those types of activities that very much sell to a local market. So that would be retailers, hairdressers, cafes, bars, restaurants. People walking past the door, they are extracting money from those pockets and selling to that local market. Exporters would be companies that sell to not just international market, but regional and national too. So they're selling beyond their borders. In a city context, that means regional, national, or international. And splitting the economy of places into these two groups tells us something very interesting. So the dark green dots look at the productivity of local services activities, and the light green dots look at the productivity of exporting type activities. Now, if we focus on the dark green dots first, the local services, what you can see there is that there's very little variation. Well, firstly, they are low productivity. And secondly, there's very little variation across the country. The performance of the local services sector is not the reason why we see variation across the country in terms of wages. If instead we then look at the lighter green dots, what you can see there is two things. First one is that they are higher productivity. In every city, every of the 62 cities that we look at across Britain, the exporting sector is more productive than the local services sector. And the second one you can see there's a much greater amount of variation in the performance of the exporting base, which we can see from our broader research very much correlates with wage performance. So it is the exporting base of an economy, which is the prosperity generating engine. And if we want to increase wages, even if we're strongly performing already, we want to increase wages even beyond that. We need to be trying to address the challenges and the opportunities that the export base faces. So filtering the economy down from thinking about all jobs, all businesses in that economy down to that exporting engine of the economy. Now, what does that look like in terms of the four Scottish cities that we look at? Well, you can see here, if you strain your eyes slightly, that the four places have been picked out. Edinburgh, very much a strong performer. Its export base is much more productive than the national average. You can see there towards the left. Glasgow, its export base pretty much sits on the line, national average line. As a big city, you might want it to do a little bit better than that, but it's performing pretty well relative to its peers elsewhere in the country. Then you can see Aberdeen, again, just below the line, but not too far below. And then the story for Dundee is a slightly worse one. You can see that it's much further towards the right-hand side of the chart, and its export base really isn't performing particularly well from a productivity perspective, and very much towards the bottom of the pack when we look at the 62 places. So it is about focusing on the export base. If we do want to increase prosperity in an area, that having that focus and narrowing down on a certain part of the economy. But the question then is, well, what's going on within that export base? How is it underperforming? In what areas? What does that then mean from a policy perspective? And what we do in the report is say, right, well, what we'll do is we'll look across 5 different aspects of the export base, try and give a bit of understanding and insight about what it is that policy should focus on if it is going to try and improve the performance of that export base. So let's run through those 5 things. Number 1, size. How big is the export base? So it can be very productive, but is it also large too in order to sort of generate as much prosperity as possible? What this chart does is it correlates size against wages. And what you can see there is a positive relationship between the two. Those places that have larger export bases also pay higher wages. So trying to increase the size of the export base should certainly be a goal of policy. Now, from the Scottish cities perspective, Edinburgh's got a very large export base relative to its population. Helps explain why Edinburgh is a very, very prosperous place, is that exports dominate its economy. This engine is very large. It's generating a lot of prosperity by bringing money in and then paying higher wages as a result. Aberdeen, on a size perspective, actually does pretty well as well. Its productivity is not as high as maybe what we would want, but its export base is large, which means at the very least it is generating, in volume terms, quite a lot of prosperity as a result of that. Glasgow and Dundee fit into the other side, though. You can see that they've got smaller export bases than what their population would suggest. I think this is a problem for Glasgow and Scotland more generally, in particular, because while the productivity of Glasgow's export base is pretty good, actually the export base is fairly small. Now, as a large place, as a large city, that is a challenge if its export base is not as large as what it should be, because that is not only affecting local prosperity, but it's having an impact on Scotland-wide prosperity too, in terms of the role that Glasgow is playing and how much prosperity it is generating for the city and the wider area as well. Number 2, cutting edge. What do we mean by that? We mean composition. So you can have a large export base, larger the better. But also what is in that export base is important too in terms of determining how well it performs. Because you could attract in a lot of exporting type companies, but if they're in call centres and low value manufacturing, that's probably not doing a great deal in terms of wages. It's much more the other end when you'd be thinking about how attractive a place is to the cutting edge of the economy, the new parts of the economy, those emerging green shoots that we think are going to drive the economy in the future. And currently, we measure that by looking at a basket of different sectors, including fintech, life sciences, AI, Internet of Things, net zero, these types of sectors that you think are, the emerging things that didn't exist probably 10 years ago, but now do exist. They're in their infancy and expected to grow. And this map looks at what the distribution of those cutting edge companies looks like across the country. Where is the cutting edge of the UK economy? Where does it locate? Well, from a UK-wide perspective, you can see there that it very much clusters in the greater southeast of England, which reflects the fact that those cities tend to have productive export bases and also tend to pay higher wages as well, as I showed in the very first bar chart. But looking further north of Scotland, reflective of some of the charts already, you see a mixed picture. So Aberdeen and Edinburgh do pretty well in terms of their number of cutting edge businesses relative to their population. Glasgow and Dundee do much less well. So, similar story in terms of this overperformance, underperformance. Now, what's interesting, though, despite that, and this where scale becomes important, is that Glasgow doesn't perform very well relative to its population, but it still has 3 times more cutting-edge businesses than what Edinburgh does, because it is a much bigger place. And so scale is important in this too, to remember, when it comes to thinking about the performance of the Scottish economy and the national economy, the underperformance or the relative performance of Glasgow in particular is really important, because its size influence means it has a much bigger influence than, say, a much smaller place like Aberdeen or like Dundee. And that's important to think about from a national perspective. So Edinburgh, Aberdeen doing well relative to their population. Glasgow not doing particularly well, but given its scale, actually still home to a lot of innovative companies. Number 3, adaptation. How well have places adapted from where traditionally we've been, which has been a manufacturing-focused economy, through to a services-focused economy? In the report, we look at how that's changed over 40 or 50 years and see how quickly places have been able to adapt. What this chart does is says, right, well, let's bring us up to today and see where places are now in terms of their balance of manufacturing these services in their export base. What we can see here when we correlate that with wages is that those places generally that have a higher share of their export base in service type activities tend to have higher paid wages. In Scotland's context, actually, the 4 places have adapted relatively well. Edinburgh, they're very much dominated by services, but actually Glasgow and Dundee, pretty services focused relative to other places. And even Aberdeen is, bottom of the pack in terms of the 4 Scottish cities, but certainly not bottom of the pack when it comes to looking at all 62 places that we look at across the country. So in general, Scotland has adapted pretty well. Now, why is this particularly important? Well, yes, there's an issue that those places that are more service focused tend to have higher wages. But I think it's also important when it comes to thinking about when places come to write local strategies, is that we have seen in previous years, and we think will be the case again as places write strategies related to the industrial strategy that is about to be published, is that they will talk about the importance of advanced manufacturing and say this is going to be a key part of our exporting industry. Now, advanced manufacturing has got a role to play, but as you can see here, we've already adapted towards services, and we expect that to continue to be so. So actually the big challenge for a number of places is not necessarily about, how do we get more manufacturing, but also actually how do we try and get more service-based activity? And so thinking about that in terms of the export base and being able to help a place adapt towards more services type activities is probably going to be quite important, while recognising that manufacturing may have a role, but not putting an undue amount of emphasis on that role. Number 4, diversification. So how reliant is a city, is the export base of a city on one particular industry? Now, this is especially relevant for Scotland, because it might not be a great surprise to anybody on the call, but the quantum is quite interesting at least, is that Aberdeen is more dependent on one sector in its export base than any other of the 62 cities in Britain that we look at. So almost 1 in 2 jobs in Aberdeen's export base is in oil and gas. So almost half of its export base is given over to just oil and gas. Now, if oil and gas is doing well, as it was certainly before the early 2010s, that's great news for Aberdeen because it is, riding on the wave of that industry. If it starts to wobble, which indeed it has done since the early 2010s, that clearly poses challenges. And if you look at the broader data in Aberdeen around house prices, around retail jobs, etc., in particular, we do see that there have been challenges around that in recent years, most likely because of the wobbles of the oil and gas industry. So being very focused on one industry, if it starts to face challenges, is not a great position to be in, and trying to therefore diversify that export base is very, very important. Elsewhere in the UK, Plymouth, Reading, Doncaster, Wakefield, Sunderland, they're the types of places that are also probably a little bit too reliant on one industry. But elsewhere in Scotland, you can see that as much less of an issue. Dundee and Edinburgh doing pretty well. Glasgow in particular has got a very diversified export base, pretty spread. So it's the case that if one part of that export base started to struggle, there are many other parts, of that export base that is able to look to instead, which I think is a stronger position to be in when you're thinking about growth into the future. Then finally, location. Where is your export base located? So this chart breaks down the UK into 4 different areas. City centres, which are the light green part. Suburbs of cities, so the rest of a city or large town, which is the dark green part. Then the hinterland around cities, the commutable distance into cities, which is the light purple part. And then deep rural will be the dark green part. So from Scotland's perspective, we're thinking about what sort of falls into that. So into the light green part, you probably get Motherwell falling into sort of the hinterland of Glasgow, and the dark green part, you're going to get some of the deeper lying parts of the Highlands, for example, to give you an idea of those different places. And what it then does, it looks at 2 indicators: area on the left, cutting edge economy, going back to that idea on the right. In terms of area, in the UK, cities account for about 8.7% of all land, which are the 2 green circles put together. If you look over to the right, they account for around about 61% of all cutting edge activity. So thinking about where this cutting edge activity wants to locate, it is thinking about a city location disproportionately. If you then go into more fine-grained detail there and look at city centres on their own, they're accounting for 0.1% of all land, but 18% of all this cutting-edge type activity. So it's very much telling us that this part of the economy that we think are going to be driving growth in the future has very clear locational preferences, not just for a city location, but for a city centre location in particular. So thinking about the role that city centres play in the Scottish economy is really, really important. We need to note at the very least that they play different roles to those hinterland areas, especially deep rural. And in terms of generating prosperity and generating higher wages, these city centres we would expect need to play, or continue to play, an outsized role. And so if you've got a city that isn't attracting in very much of this cutting edge activity, that's a challenge not just for the city, but actually for the Scottish economy and the UK economy as well. And I'll go into what that looks like for the individual cities on the next slide, which puts all of this together. So recap, I've run across 5 different indicators that try and measure the strength of the export base. If we put them all together on this one chart, this radar chart, it helps show you in a snapshot how well different places are doing. Now, how do you read this? If the line is closer to the very outside of that radar chart, you're doing quite well on a number of indicators. If it's closer towards the middle, then you're not doing so well. You don't rank so well relative to other places on that indicator. So if we look at the purple line, Edinburgh, you can see that's doing pretty well. Got a very large export base. It's got a lot of cutting edge type activity in that export base too. So large and high value, exactly the place where you want to be. It's got a lot of services as well. It's adapted well in terms of the shifts in the national and in the global economy. Where's probably got maybe slightly more challenge, something to think about, is that of the cutting edge businesses it has, not so many of those are based in the city centre. Is that a challenge? Is Edinburgh city centre not playing the role maybe that is what it should do? How does that interact with the heritage element that is in Edinburgh city centre that might be constraining its growth to some extent, and may mean that you think about what that then means? And then from the diversity of its export base and a ranking perspective, it's probably not quite as diverse as some other cities in the UK, but in general, probably not something to worry about too much because in the quantum terms, it isn't too over specialised. If we then say pick Dundee instead, we can see there, which is the dark green line, small export base, not very much cutting edge type activity within it. It does okay on the services side, not the worst, but not the best. Where it's got a relatively diverse or a diversity of the export base, maybe could diversify a little bit more, something to think about, but not too much of a challenge. What it does probably do better is that while it hasn't got very much of the cutting edge economy, what it does have at least does cluster in the centre of Dundee. So there's something there to work with that, Dundee city centre appears to be showing some degree of being an attractive place to come and invest. How do we double down on that? How do we try and make that an even more attractive proposition to try and increase prosperity in Dundee? So that's the presentation of the main focus. Let me now show you very briefly the data tool that we also have on our website as well. So I'm just going to call that up, and then I can show you the journey that you go on in terms of being able to find the data tool. So as I said at the start, one of the things that sits in Cities Outlook is a top 10 and bottom 10 across a range of different economic indicators. But as well as having the top 10, bottom 10 in the report itself, we also publish all the data online so you can see where your city sits. So in order to do that, you go to centreforcities.org. You then click on data here at the top, and the featured part of that is the data tool. And you click on there, and that will pull the data tool up. If we then scroll down, we have a little bit of information at the top. We get to this bit, which is the main part of the data tool. We have a number of different buttons which look at indicators, show the indicators that we've got available. So we've got population, business, wages, skills, environment, etc., etc. Now let's have a look at skills, which calls up the skills there, and you scroll down a little bit. You then have a choice about what type of skills we're interested in. So let's click on no formal qualifications at all, and that will load up the data. And we've got a number of ways that we then display that data. So again, we've got a top 10, bottom 10 there. You can see that Aberdeen has the lowest share of people with no formal qualifications of any city in the UK, which is a great place to be. We have a map there where you can see that most of the Scottish cities are doing well. Glasgow probably ranking not quite so well on this measure. And if we scroll down, then you can see a chart here which shows how cities are located, or where cities are located. And if you scroll over, you then also get it tells you what their data is as well. So I said earlier, Aberdeen, the best performing city on this measure, which is a great place to be in. If we scroll up and look for Glasgow, this is where Glasgow then sits. About 1 in 10 people have no formal qualifications. Not the worst performing city by any stretch of the imagination, but it's probably more of a challenge. It's an issue that's more of a challenge in Glasgow than is the case in the other Scottish cities that we look at. That's just a snapshot. You can go and play till your heart's content on the data tool. If you have any questions on that after you have played around with it, please do drop us a line. But speaking of questions, let's take the final 6 or 7 minutes to look at to run through a few questions. So first off, Miriam Fitzpatrick says, great work. That's very kind of you to say, so thank you. We'd love to see the equivalent for Irish cities. So that's a great question. So we focus on the UK. We do have data on Belfast, but we only have that for a limited number of indicators because the Belfast, or the way Northern Ireland collects statistics, is different to the rest of the UK. It's a devolved issue, and the amount of data that it produces not as much as what we see elsewhere. We would also then like to extend it out to Ireland. That would be nice, but again, there's much greater data challenges. So we haven't got that currently, but maybe in the future we might be able to do that. Someone who hasn't left their name, please leave your name. It'd be great to know who you are. Says, how are Scottish cities doing on housing this year? So very interesting in terms of housing, that in general, affordability in Scottish cities is better than it is in the rest of the UK. From the top of my head, Edinburgh, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the most expensive but relative to other UK cities is certainly not in the top 5, and I don't think it's in the top 10 either. Doesn't mean there's not something we would do about that to try and make it even more affordable, but it's in an interesting position there, being a strong economy, but actually house prices not being potentially as big a constraint as maybe in some of our other most successful economies. I think the big story from housing, from a Scottish perspective, is how Aberdeen has been doing. And if you go on the data tool, you'll be able to see that actually house prices in Aberdeen have been declining for a number of years, which is something that certainly people outside of Scotland are not particularly aware of. And I think that in part points to the struggles that that over-reliance on oil and gas has produced, and that industry has started to wobble, and then all of a sudden the demand for housing has started to fall as a result. I think that then means that Glasgow is now the most affordable city in the UK, which on the face of it is a good thing, but the reasons for that, obviously, in terms of the wobbling of its economy, are not good things. What we want is to have an affordable place with a strong economy. So that's the most interesting from I think from a housing perspective for Scotland. Peter Horston, I thought I've got your name right there, Peter, apologies if not, says, is Aberdeen's relatively high wages in the export base, despite having a relatively low export base in size terms, explained by the dominance of oil and gas sector in the city's export base? And what would be the policy response helping Aberdeen shift to a service-orientated export base? So that second one is the real tricky one, isn't it? So first one is, yes, I think it is down to oil and gas. I think that does show the benefit of, if you've got your fortunes hooped to a relatively highly productive sector, then that means that it does pull up wages, as opposed to, say, a Wakefield or a Doncaster, where they're very dominated by one sector. That sector is distribution, and distribution pays low wages. So in that respect, Aberdeen is in a strong place. Of course, the challenge then comes is that if you do then have this wobble of that sector, what does that then mean for the future? And there's a long history, sadly, of where cities have been over-reliant on one industry, and that then having problems further down the line when that industry wobbles. What you do about it is the real challenge. So Aberdeen, does well because it's got very natural geographic advantages in terms of access to North Sea oil and gas fields. The challenge for Aberdeen is, how does it then become an attractive location for investment in other cutting-edge service-based activities? That in part is around things like skills, like transport, like availability of commercial space. What we know is that skills Aberdeen does pretty well on. Transport, there's probably some improvements to make, but it does okay. There's a question about whether commercial space is of the mix, particularly in city centre, in order to attract some of these activities in. I think there's a broader challenge that Aberdeen's location is probably an issue too, but clearly there are very few things that we can do about that. And so the question is, how do you try and sort of work within that to make Aberdeen more attractive? And I would start by looking at those indicators, which our data tool has got the data on. Lauren Lilly says, I saw that Dundee city centre is now considered a good place to invest. Is there a way that tracks how this has changed over time, specifically whether the V&A made an impact on investment? A very interesting question. What impact does culture-led investment have on Dundee? So let me say just a little bit more about the Dundee story. Dundee as a whole doesn't attract in a great deal of cutting-edge companies. And that's a challenge in terms of wages in the city today and wages in the future too. So it's got a very small cutting-edge economy within its boundaries. Of that very small amount that it's got, that has at least shown a disproportionate desire to be in Dundee city centre, but that is, we're talking about a very small part which is assigned to make that choice. I think that's shown a certain degree of a signal that shows signs of encouragement of something to work with. But the challenge is that if that city centre was performing well and was actually attracting a large number of cutting-edge companies, then Dundee as a whole, therefore, would have a lot of these cutting-edge companies. So what I would say is that there's something to work with there, rather than it showing that Dundee is a city centre is a very attractive place to come and invest in. So it's sorting that out. Good news in that some are going there, but how do we try and expand on that? Because the broader challenge is that it probably isn't as attractive as what it should be. What impact has the V&A had? We haven't measured that, is the short answer. The longer answer is, what do we think the mechanism is in terms of trying to change how attractive Dundee city centre is? Does it do anything about commercial space? Does it do anything about skills? Does it do anything about transport, for example? And the answer is probably not a great deal. So it's great from a cultural perspective. It's probably maybe it's quite good from a branding perspective, but it's not clear about the things that really matter that are going to impact on a business's decision to come and invest. How exactly that figures in, try to alter that decision. Now, that isn't to say that an investment like the V&A isn't a good thing to do from a broader perspective of cities as places to come and spend leisure, from a civic pride perspective, those types of things. I think sometimes we're a little bit unfair in terms of how much we expect things like an art gallery or the award of City of Culture or creation of a cultural quarter, about what we expect those things to do, because we sort of expect to do a whole range of different things. And where the reality is on the economy side in particular, I just don't think that tool's cut out to try and influence the performance of the economy. We shouldn't unfairly expect that to be the case. Right, I'm going to take one more question very briefly because I know we're over time. Stephen Lake says, what recommendations based on your analysis would you give to the Scottish National Investment Bank? An excellent question. Number of things. First off is focus on the export base of places. How to try and make Scotland generally, but the cities of Scotland in particular, are more attractive places for investment from these export-led type activities. Within that, then, it's noting that place plays a very important role in this. The different parts of the Scottish economy play different roles in that economy. The city centres of those 4 cities in particular should be playing an outsized role in attracting in cutting-edge type activities. If they're not, what's the investment bank going to do in terms of trying to change that? And noting that role is different then to the suburbs, to hinterlands and deep-lying rural areas, which means that there's a focus and a priority that needs to be given to where that investment is then made. Now, that isn't to say that that you then wouldn't invest in things like offshore wind, etc., which from an Aberdeen perspective may be important from a diversity of its economy in particular. But it is at least starting out from the perspective of noting that different parts of Scotland play different roles, rather than sort of implicitly assuming that all parts play the same role. Because if we go down that route, then you cause a challenge about trying to target limited resources. And if you don't target those limited resources, you're probably not going to have policy have the impact that we necessarily think it can do to try and improve the Scottish economy as a whole. I think within that, and we've written separately about this, and this sort of comes out a little bit within this presentation, is that Glasgow in particular underperforms, as do a number of other large cities south of the border too. It's a UK problem that big cities underperform. Now that's a challenge because underperformance is an issue in itself, but underperformance of a big place has much bigger implications than underperformance of a small place. I think for Scotland's economy more generally, trying to improve Glasgow as a place to come in and do business is a really, really important part of making Scotland more prosperous as a result. So different places play different roles. The cities in particular have got a role to play, but Glasgow's underperforms especially is something to be concerned about that we should be trying to address. I've gone 4 minutes over, so I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you, everybody, for joining the call. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions too. I hope the questions were interesting to others watching, and I hope the answers were good answers as well. You can find all of our resources freely available on our website. I've run you through the data tool already, but we've got the report, this report and other reports too, podcasts, blogs, etc. too, which hopefully give you a lot of food for thought. And if you have any questions to us, please do feel free to drop me a line, or if it's worth us having a chat at any point, please do drop us a line about that as well. Until then,